Welcome to Grappling with a Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I'd like to welcome my guests for today. We have Nick Gallo, also known as the Ethics Evangelist, who is the CEO of Compliance Line, as well as creator and host of the Ethics Experts podcast. Kimi Hirotsu Zimski is founder of KSP Partnership, providing project management and project leadership courses and workshops to improve team dynamics and communications. And Annette Simmons is a speaker, trainer, consultant, and author of The Story Factor, named, wow, one of the 100 best business books of all time.
Me and two other women. Thank you.
Wow, I don't know how we got you on the show, but thank you for joining us.
Big get. It's a big get.
It is.
And here is today's ethics challenge. From last week's headlines. A St. Louis man who lived in Germany for 3 decades under a false identity was sentenced in federal court to time served and 3 years of supervised release. After graduating high school in 1981, DeLeo Barner joined the military. In 1984, he was dismissed from the military for missing a readiness alert. Within 3 weeks of returning to the home of his youth, 2 of Barner's friends were shot dead on the streets of his neighborhood in St. Louis. Many others were either dead or in prison. Wanting to rejoin the military and escape the violence of his neighborhood, Barner stole the identity of another St. Louis man and joined the army as Joel Sanders. He was stationed in Berlin for many years until receiving a medical discharge in 1988. For the next 3 decades, he remained in Germany, working for security firms there. He built a civilian life as Joel Sanders until 2018, when his ruse was discovered. At the time of his arrest, Barner had a German girlfriend and 8 children, 6 of whom still reside in Berlin. He pled guilty to 1 count of fraud and was sentenced to time served, but the terms of his release prevent him from returning to his home in Germany and to his family, including his 13-year-old daughter. Granted that he had been actively engaged in the crime of fraud for 3 decades, should the law take into account specific conditions of essentially victimless crimes committed in the distant past, or does the integrity of the legal system require accountability from offenders regardless of collateral damage? The floor is open.
Oh,
It's a real hard one.
Yeah, well,
I have to say, it would have been a very different question had there not been children, and obviously, apparently 2 mothers.
it's not clear. It
children.
sounded like 1, but I'm not sure.
Right. At that point, you perpetrated a fraud on your children, not just on society or the Veterans Administration. That is a whole different ball of wax. But I think you need to pause and consider when those children were born, or when they were in fact conceived. He had an opportunity to make a decision, to make a clean break of it, and to be able to honestly give his name to his children, as opposed to perpetuating a lie. If I recall correctly, they said he did the wrong thing for the right reasons. It's still a wrong thing.
That makes sense. I can see how when we look at fairness, and our legal system is really, one way to look at it is it's a social engineering system designed to create justice, and designed to create a solid civilization, good behavior more than bad behavior. And so is it achieving its objectives? When we apply a law based on the fact that all applications of this law must be applied to every individual consistently, disregarding their extenuating circumstances. What we do is we choose one definition of fair out of many definitions that are available to us. Protecting the weak from the powerful is another goal of our legal system. And so, are we achieving the goals that we want to achieve? Consistency is just one way to interpret fairness. When I work with companies who are implementing algorithms that have reached the level of sociopathic consistency, what happens is that they drive out the urge and the frequency to behave with mercy and forgiveness. And so for me, society, we have to look at the logistics of what produces acts of mercy. And working with the DOJ, for instance, one of the programs that I was familiar with that really worked is they would go in to find the most violent offenders. They would have all the data they needed to charge these guys with. And instead, what they chose to do is bring them into a room with somebody from the civic society, a policeman, a lawyer, and ideally their mother or a family member, and say, we won't charge you, even though we have all this evidence, if you can change your behavior. And so I look at it from both sides as to, are we producing the frequency of acts of mercy if we can only define fairness as a consistent application of law?
It's a pretty interesting perspective. Yeah.
What do you think, Nick?
What'd you say?
What do you think?
Well, I think that these two responses were pretty interesting. And when Kimi was, am I pronouncing that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm delighted. Thank you.
So when Kimi was talking about it, you kind of went a different angle than I thought. When you were bringing up the kids involved, I thought you were going to say, you know, it doesn't seem like it's right because he now can't see his kids, but you actually went kind of before that, where he kind of did an injustice to his kids by sort of inferring that he must have raised them under his false name or never gave them his real name. You know, and I also think it's a little bit interesting to talk about this from the perspective of him, like perpetuating, what was the word? It was like, he has been perpetuating a fraud this whole time. Versus like he committed fraud once and now he's just sort of like on that path. That consistent application of the fraud can maybe give some credence to like this ruling. I mean, the cross-border thing notwithstanding, I think, look, if there were no kids involved, I don't think any of us would say one way or another that like, oh, it's, you know, such a crime against humanity that he can't go back to Germany. I mean, it's almost like that extenuating circumstance of the kids being part of the equation, you know, could be sort of something that's like tipping the scales, at least in my own heart, to say, well, I'll send him back. Joel, what's his first name? What was his name? The first name? DeLeo. What's the difference, you know? But I mean, he was perpetuating a fraud for a long time. It was a fraudulent act that he did, that he, you know, continued on time and time again. Whether or not he told his wife or his girlfriend or the kids, like, by the way, my name's, you know, DeLeo, is kind of neither here nor there. You know what I'm saying? And, you know, I guess what I was thinking about was like, there's some crimes you commit where there's a statute of limitations on it, but like, if his crime was perpetuating the whole time, well, then there's no statute of limitations that could even sort of in theory or just sort of conceptually be applied here, irrespective of when it was first kind of kicked off, you know?
I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, there's so many layers here. I already feel we're running short on time, but you know, if it would have been a one-time act of fraud, excuse me, then the statute of limitations certainly would be up and there'd be nothing to talk about. So even though it was a one-time act of identity theft, by perpetuating it, the statute of limitations does not become an issue. Is that enough of a principle of law that the fallout on the family should be the difference. There's a Jewish parable about a man comes into court, accused of a serious crime, and clearly evidence is against him. And the judge is about to rule when his wife comes in and says, "Your Honor, you're going to effectively make me a widow. What did I do wrong?" And his children come in and say, "Your Honor, you're going to make us orphans. What did we do wrong?" And his creditors come in and say, "Your Honor, we're not going to be able to recoup our debts. What did we do wrong?" What's the judge supposed to do in that case?
Well, he shouldn't have lent to a criminal. Shouldn't have married a criminal. Yeah.
I mean, basically, it's sorry, justice is blind means that you don't look at those other factors.
Well, and that gets back to Annette's point about, fairness. Like, what is the actual goal? Is it consistent application? Does that push us toward psychopathy? Or do we have to look at these other sort of factors and these other sort of qualitative, the impact of the externalities of that decision and stuff like that? It's
right. And that's when you start getting into the whole concept of victimless crimes, which I think is a terrible misconception. But when you have it weighed against extenuating factors, maybe it starts to add weight to the equation. What do you think?
I think it does to a certain extent. That is a week of time served in what is most probably a county jail, not pleasant, I'll grant, but not exactly Sing Sing. And 100 hours of community service, which I would wager that between the four of us, we probably do more than that in any given quarter without having a judge say thou shalt. I think they've already taken into account a number of things and made the point that it was a wrong thing, regardless of the reason for doing it. It was a wrong thing. You knew it was the wrong thing when you did it. That's the other point that I think is getting lost a little bit here. He knew it was not the right thing. Barring him from access to his children, was there anything in the ruling that said that he could not bring his children here? Because whether he raised them as Mr. Saunders or Mr. Barron, those children are American citizens. Not wanting him to go to Europe, I can sort of understand that. That's
a good point.
Where are you going to go next thing?
I wonder if his livelihood could be continued if he, or if he would just basically lose his business. I'll have to admit, I read this on Sunday, and not knowing that I was going to be invited to do this, and immediately I can hear the soundtrack to Les Mis. Because it's Jean Valjean. I mean, it's totally, he did a wrong thing, but he did it to survive. And so having worked in insecure communities, I've seen situations where it feels like a life or death situation. And he escaped. And after that, his criminal action was simply to continue to use the name. But think of all the opportunities he had to act in another way. This forgiveness, if you will, whether it was planned or not, contributed to a lot of, at least 8 new lives. And his contribution to our military, even if he was using the wrong name, he is a veteran.
Yeah, he didn't miss any more readiness.
He was actually got awards, didn't he? Didn't he get medals for his performance levels?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, he didn't miss another readiness alert, that's for sure.
That is true. That is true. I think it might be interesting because if I remember correctly, he founded a security firm. Yeah. So I'm sorry, but are you going to hire somebody I mean, I'm just asking, is that really the best qualification? So, Annette, would he lose his livelihood? He might need to find something else to do for a livelihood.
I don't know. I mean, I can kind of argue against that a little bit. Like, we've all done unethical things. I don't think there's anybody on this call who's done something unethical, even though I'm the ethics evangelist. Like, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I've done unethical things for sure. And I don't think any of us are perfect. Anyways, I know you're not kind of saying that, but that Jean Valjean thing is a big point. And Annette, when you were talking about like part of the purpose of the law is to protect the weak from the strong. I mean, you could argue that whatever he was running from was in itself a failure of the law, because those murders were able to happen, and that sort of insecure community was able to persist in the face of, the rule of law and stuff like that. I mean, I don't know how good that argument kind of stands up like in a debate or whatever, but to your point, I mean, if there's a lot of like survival instinct that comes into play, and just like, I just got to get out of here. I don't want to get killed myself. It was a lapse of judgment for sure.
Yeah. And Jean Valjean stole a piece of bread to feed a child. So,
Right.
so this is an archetypal dilemma. I mean,
Exactly.
it's been treated over and over and over again. And our answers change as time goes by. In this particular situation, we're 20 years into social media, algorithms, and a drift away from social trust. Social trust, according to Edelson, is just plummeted. And so when I ask myself why, it's because I see a vast difference between the transactional nature of loyalty and the reciprocity nature of trust. And so trust is by definition an irrational act. It's having faith in someone, whether you know what's going to happen in the future or not. And so when we are bleeding trust from our institutions, it occurs to me that we need to look at how these systems actually destroy trust. For instance, he served the United States. He's served, his and security. I mean, half the guys I know from the CIA use a fake name all the time anyway. So it's part of the job. It's part of the job in security. So I just look at it in terms of where is it that we allow mercy? And so to your point with the Midrash story, the children, the creditors, the wife, who's most important here? And when you change the context, so in a smaller context, what's important is the rule of law. But in a larger context, what's important is, are we building social trust back into our systems? Or are we letting it just drain away with our adherence to this extremist notion that fairness equals consistency?
Right. That's a big point.
I think that's a really
an
good
excellent
point. Right? Because we hear these stories of people who did horrible things and got a slap on the wrist, and people who did relatively trivial things and got sent to jail for 20 years.
Totally.
And
Right.
that erodes our trust in the system, because there doesn't, and it's not the inconsistency per se, it's the lack of proportionality, because some judges
Proportional
come down
response.
heavy on the side of justice, and other judges come down heavy on the side of mercy, and their vision of one or the other does not conform with the mainstream. And so, as you say in that very well, that we lose trust in the institution, and yet there is a plea of nolo contendere, where we essentially, I can throw myself on the mercy of the court. I can say, I don't have a case, and yet I think I'm entitled to mercy. And what
Or
I'm
even
saying is, I'm
unentitled to
putting
mercy.
What's that?
This whole mercy is by definition an unentitled,
Right, it's the
forgiveness.
suspension of
It
justice,
is a-
exactly.
Yeah.
It is a grace. It is
Yes.
a grace.
Yes.
But it's interesting that is built into the system to a small degree.
It's built into the system when human beings, like judges, are making these decisions. And so I have to look at my corporate work is if algorithms are making the decisions and you don't have a human, you actually prevent empathy, because empathy by definition is a deviation from the standard operating procedure. In a hospital, if I have a system and I'm supposed to put through patients every 15 minutes, somebody needs a little longer time. Empathy is basically disobeying the standard operating procedure. Some people need to let's just go. And so it's this variation in application that I think can only exist within ethical human. And so I like to think we make room for not just algorithms, but humans.
It's interesting that sort of, to the extent that an application of empathy in that it is a deviation from a system is the root of ethical humans, it's almost like the most ethical thing to do is maybe breaking the rules.
Very often, I believe. I've watched it, and so that's why. And let me, because only story can handle that crazy paradox.
Correct, 100%.
Stories for me evolved as an evolutionary way to handle paradox. So, for instance, one of the paradoxes that it's become extremist is safety versus freedom. And so the fact is that it's safety and freedom, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. It's not a conflict. It's, this back and forth. And what we're finding with this whole idea that that consistency is quality in corporate, or consistency is justice, is it's eroded our capacity to toggle back and forth between paradoxes, and caused us to become so divisive that we act like there's one's right and one's wrong.
Right.
And it doesn't matter which side, it's not enough.
Yeah,
That's why
it's
we're here
like
grappling with
story is
gray.
like the anti-algorithm. It's the anti-binary black and white.
Oh, I like that.
It's the
Yeah.
antidote to that or something. Yeah.
Mhm. Yes, yes. And
I
that's
think also, the dimensions of
Yeah.
humanity, grace, and faith, regardless of what you call your faith, would also suggest that maybe it's not so much, Nick, maybe it's not so much breaking rules as knowing which times it is a rule and which times it is a guideline by which you can rule.
And I think that's what people mean when they say the spirit of the intent of the law.
Mhm.
I would hope.
Yes, me too. Me too.
So there's this interesting model that I've been kind of like playing around with a little bit, where we think that the opposite of compliance is defiance, or we think, that those are two sort of different things, but they're actually kind of the same. They're kind of two different sides of the same coin.
Paradox.
I think the opposite of defiance is like, the antidote to defiance is not forcing compliance. It's probably more like connection, which can be only like happen through story, to Annette's point.
Yeah, and so we've for me, our society got on this idea that we could create clarity. All we need is better tech to create clarity.
Correct.
And we have reached the point of diminishing returns.
Yeah, totally have.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh, and gone way past it.
Way past.
Well, I mean, to that point, it's like we're inundated with so much data. We're inundated with so much information and we don't have sort of like the task switching capabilities to actually process it. So we almost correspondingly devolve into just algorithmic black and white binary thinking about everything as well, which causes sort of the evaporation away of the humanization of whatever we're talking about, because there's so much nuance in it. Nothing's black and white. And I'll tell you one thing. There are like artists or like musicians that I can't stand. I hate their music. And then I watch a documentary on them and I'm like, I love them. They're just like me. You know what I'm saying? It's like that's that power of story to humanize everything and like gives us something to actually relate to, because we're not these analytical automatons. We're just bags of like emotion. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I mean, Victor Hugo wrote this novel. Think about how many times it's been replayed and different performances, everything like that. We crave the story of mercy. And it's
Right.
almost always going to
And
violate.
also of redemption.
Yes, it's going to violate logic. So you were talking about a paradox, Nick, of the compliance defiance. There's so many paradoxes I'm working with, because when you define culture is actually a society's response to an unresolvable paradox. So you have universality versus specificity. So universality is everybody gets treated the same, and so that tends to be from headquarters, because headquarters is like, okay, everybody's going to have to be on the same pay grade, and that's the way we're going to keep it right. But in the field where life is lived, you have specificity, which is, you know what, this kid may be 19 years old, but he produces 4 times as much as any other person here, and I need to pay him more or we're going to lose him.
Right.
Right.
And so it's just the understanding for me that story is just as good a way to sort through an ethics issue as logic. But understanding, I think people aren't yet prepared to realize it's going to be a violation of logic. Mercy, empathy, redemption. That's not a linear path.
No, it's not. But
I think actually it's not a violation
I
at
agree.
all. It is an expansion. When I teach critical thinking, I always tell people, do not ignore your gut. Do not ignore your heart, because the minute you do, you will forget how the other people in that situation, how their gut and their heart are affecting their capacity to actually think through, validate, question, and accept or intelligently decline a position. And
yeah, I think
stories are incredibly powerful to help that along.
Absolutely. That's what creates our theory of mind.
It is the ability to remember, this is a metaphor. This is an analogy. This is going to help me to understand it, but it's not the same as an absolute truth.
The only reason I mention a violation of logic is because I have been in a room of people from different arms in the military, CIA, whatever, and military historians. And when I start talking about story, everybody from the field, anybody who's been in a warfighting situation immediately knows the value of story. But the military historians say that I've devolved into moral relativism. And so when I face these criticisms, and believe me, I get hammered with that stuff. What they're saying is it's illogical. And so I guess I'm kind of preempting that by trying to say, heads up, this is not going to necessarily follow your linear logic. So that's where that came from. I appreciate you clarifying that. Absolutely is part of critical thinking.
Well, I mean,
we are, excuse me, Nick, we are at the end of our first segment. It has been absolutely exhausting trying to get you folks to contribute to this discussion.
It's a good one.
It is wonderful.
In all seriousness, it's been delightful. I love it when I can just sit back and let you go. One of the lines that I use a lot is that ethics begins where compliance ends. And I think it ties in with the idea that we've been discussing, that compliance has a lot to do with the brain and the logic, and ethics has to do with the heart.
Yeah.
And the gut.
That's nice.
And that you can't have one without the other.
Right.
They have to both be there, and they are going to be in conflict, and they're going to be there's going to be a tension. And it's not that we resort to illogic, but that we represent that there are times that elements transcend logic, or there's a supra logic, something that's beyond.
Super logic,
Yeah.
like that. Or a psycho logic.
Yeah, and ethics is really about real ethics or ethical challenges or conflicts between right and right or wrong and wrong,
Yeah.
and having to choose when you have too many good options or no good options. So I think
Yes.
we're going to find plenty to talk about in the second segment. But for now, we're going to wrap up the first one. And so thank you so much, Nick Gallo, Kimi Hirotsu Zimski, and Annette Simmons. This has been absolutely delightful discussion. For those of you who are watching or listening, if you have an ethical scenario that you would like to suggest, please go to my website, jonasandgoldson.com, and get in touch. If you have a compelling idea, we will definitely take it up. If you are a Grappling with Gray member, please use the community link to participate in a follow-up open forum and continue discussion. If you're not a member, please go to gwtg.live. That's gwtg.live. And you can get a 30-day free trial to enjoy member benefits. Please join us again next week.
And this is where it gets real good now. This is about to get real good.
Yeah, we're gonna
Yes.
take the gloves
Behind the
off in next
curtain.
section.
Okay. Yeah.
As we continue to grapple with the gray.